Continue this morning in Matthew chapter 24, reading from verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all of these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." He sat on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" That was Matthew 24, verses 1 through 3. In the chapter that we covered last week, chapter 23, we saw that Jesus had dealt with the problem of the Pharisees by exposing their falsehood and by predicting that judgment for all of the long history of Israel's leaders rejecting God and killing his prophets would come in the time of their own generation. The passage that we've read this morning is a direct continuation of that prediction. As Jesus is leaving the temple area, he prophesies of the invasion of Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70 when General Titus of the Roman legion invaded and laid utter waste to the temple and all that surrounded it. That would take place 30 plus years in the future from the time that Jesus spoke these words. And so, having heard Jesus say this thing, understandably, the disciples have questions. Well, they have two questions, to be precise. And we must keep in mind these two questions as we journey through the rest of this chapter. The first question, when will these things be? Which is a very specific question considering the context. The disciples are asking, when will the temple be destroyed? The second question is, what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? Before we can understand Jesus' answer, we have to understand what this question even means. And to do that, first, let us remember what Jesus had said at the very end of chapter 23. He said these words, "For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And that was Matthew 23, verse 39. Jesus said this as he wept over Jerusalem. Now, the people of Jerusalem had already sang these very words during his first entrance into the city. And so the disciples quite accurately perceive that Jesus has referenced a second coming. Their knowledge of just what that would mean, of course, is quite limited. But they knew enough to connect his second coming to the end of the age, which they were expecting. And if we understand Jewish apocalyptic expectation, what this meant was the end of the kingdoms of men and the consummation of the earthly reign of Messiah, the very dawning of God's eternal kingdom. And so mistakenly, they connect the destruction of the temple to this same event, or at the very least, are quite confused how the two can go together at all. And let's read their questions again along with the beginning of Christ's answer now, and we will continue from there. Reading again, verse 3. "And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?' And Jesus answered them, 'See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains.'" Matthew chapter 24, verses 3 through 8. Now, taken in context, the first thing that we realize about Jesus' answer is that he is teaching his disciples that there will be a delay, and that they need to begin to redefine whatever expectations that they may have had for him regarding their own personal and immediate future. The first thing he says is, "See that no one leads you astray." And that has a very immediate application before he says anything else, that they should begin by not allowing their own expectations, the ones that perhaps prompted them to ask their question in the manner that they had, to deceive them. And then he begins to describe this indefinite period of delay, one that we know has lasted for almost 2,000 years. And how he describes this period of time, we will all relate with, I'm sure, because we have experienced these very things now for the entirety of our adult Christian lives. False messiahs, fear-mongering, war-mongering, food shortages, natural disasters, conflict, strife. Now, we understand false messiah can have a very specific meaning and a very general one. Very specifically, it can describe people who put themselves forward as God or as Christ returned. I mean, this happens. I mean, not as much. Much more often, though, are people who, in the light of the fear-mongering and disaster and strife of the world, put themselves forward as the solution, or as at least providing the solution and apart from Christ. This can come in the form of a charismatic leader, a government official, institution, or even corporation. And Jesus says, these things must happen. They are not the end, they are just the beginning. And he uses a very informative metaphor to describe the period of delay that he is teaching us about. The tribulations that occur during what we know as the church age, he calls them birthing pains. And as we all know very well, birth pains are foreboding tremors which increase in intensity and duration until at last the woman is onset by a terrible pain, which is the event of childbirth itself. It is unknown precisely when that event will come, as the tremors begin, or precisely how long they will even last. Only that they will culminate in due time. And after the pain will come great joy. It is not unreasonable to read all of this into Jesus' choice of metaphor. Jesus is very intentional in using the imagery that he does. Now, what Jesus is describing here doesn't really answer the disciples' questions, to be honest. But it does at least set up the answer. You see, they had asked about the destruction of the temple, Jesus' second coming, and the culmination of the kingdom of God. Well, what they had really asked for was the sign of his coming, which was a way for them to ask, how will we know that the time has come for all of these things we've been waiting for to finally take place? And Jesus has first described the condition of the world during the period of delay. Now, this was a necessary detour, and in a way, he's going to continue on this detour before he gets to finally answering their question, because having described the general condition of the world during this intermediate period of delay, Jesus will now describe what believers will experience, more specifically, really what we can expect as the church to experience within the church during this tribulation that we must endure until he comes. Reading now from verse 9, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." That was Matthew 24, verses 9 through 14. And what Jesus doesn't do is describe the church age as a progressive march of successful ministry, at least by American definition, on into utopia. You know, Jesus loves his people, so he isn't going to cherry-coat this thing for us. He's going to tell it to us straight, and he is telling us how it's going to be, how it has been for 2,000 years, how it is, and how it's going to be until the end. In this world, you will find trouble, Jesus said. Now, if they hated Jesus, and they delivered Jesus up to death, then we can expect no different treatment at the hands of the world. We will not be celebrated by the world. Now, Satan, he will be celebrated by the world, and this is nothing new. It is perhaps more blatant than ever, but what Satan stands for has long been celebrated by the world. The world has always been beholden to Satan's agenda of self-exaltation. So no, we will not be celebrated for our faith, a faith that exalts God above the self. And Jesus tells us here what our reception from the world will be, what will be the world's treatment of us. But surely we can expect better treatment within the walls of the church. But Jesus here says no. Jesus says what we can expect from within the church is that many will fall away. In other words, many false conversions will take place. Many posers and pretenders will enter into fellowship with God's faithful. And their leaving will only demonstrate that they never belonged. But even worse than this, some will betray and turn against those in the church. And they will stir up strife and discord and separate believers from one another if they can. And this is what the Lord teaches us, that there will be many false prophets and preachers and teachers, many of whom will have churches, big churches, small churches, radio ministries, TV ministries, social media ministries. And again, their aim will be to lead away from the truth. They will not present themselves as false prophets or teachers, of course. They will present themselves as true, and they will imitate the truth up to a point. And taking all of this together, all of that Jesus is describing, Jesus describes a very bad situation. Jesus says because of this lawlessness, and by the way, Jesus doesn't mean political anarchy when he says lawlessness. When he says lawlessness, he means spiritual lawlessness. In other words, people in the church pretending to be a church, but not living for God's will. Because of the lawlessness in the world and the lawlessness even in the church, people's hearts will grow cold. In other words, they will grow bitter, disillusioned, disappointed, dejected, depressed, jaded, and they will be tempted to give up on God, to give up on the church, and maybe even to give up on life. And it is in this context that Jesus says, but the one who doesn't give up, the one who keeps their faith through the hellscape that Jesus describes, only those who preserve their faith will show that they are truly saved. But why? Why all of this? Why let God's people live through such tribulation? Because the gospel must be preached. If the world was not evil, there would be no reason for the gospel. If there was no gospel, then there would be no need for perseverance. But the very state of the world demonstrates the need for the gospel. And if the gospel is needed, then there must be those who remain faithful to God so that the gospel remains among us until the end. But before the end, tribulation. And so, this begins to set the stage for Jesus to answer the two questions that the disciples had asked. It sets the stage by correcting the misconception they had that these things would be imminent, that there would be no delay. But Jesus describes a period of delay, and after this he will begin to address their first question regarding his prophecy that the temple will be destroyed. We read now about this from verse 15. So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Matthew chapter 24, verse 15 through 21. Looking back from our historical vantage point, we can see that this event occurred already in 70 A.D. Everything Jesus describes in these verses fits in an exact description of this event, of the fall of Jerusalem, and marks the end here of an unfaithful Judaism, the end of the temple era. This was, in fact, the judgment that Jesus had already spoken of when condemning the leaders of Jerusalem in the previous chapter. Jesus tells us in terms of one singular event, the suffering of the people in Jerusalem will be incomparable to any other singular event that will ever happen, even on into the future, into the end of the world. Now, tribulations as a whole will increase, but this event will stand out amongst all of the travails. Now, Jesus has addressed first the states of the world during this time of delay. Then he has addressed the state of his people here. And now he has addressed, finally, in answer to the question the disciples posed first, the state of unfaithful Judaism, that the temple shall be destroyed. And there is a little more to this as far as unfaithful Judaism goes, but Paul will begin to unfold this in the book of Romans. But what I'm saying here is that Jesus has just given a summary of the concept and, of course, predicted the fall of the temples. Now, after this, we can see that Jesus will pivot back to speaking more generally of these days of increasing tribulation. And this is what we read now from verse 22. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So, if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. And that was Matthew chapter 24, verses 22 through 28. I think we can see the reason Jesus pivots back to a more general description of the intermediate period of delay, and that is to emphasize the prevalence of deception that all of us will face and will increasingly face until the end. I believe it is possible that the first few verses of this section give us a window into the very mind of God concerning his determination on when things will end. Nothing specific, of course, but Jesus tells us that things will get so bad as far as deception, as far as there being so many false alternatives to a real and biblical Christian faith, as far as there being so many signs and wonders, maybe scientific breakthroughs, who knows, maybe science will take us so far as to end natural death, to upload our conscious minds to the cloud. Or maybe it will be neural links, maybe it will be cellular regeneration, who can say, but whatever it is, it will be devoid of God. Now we can be sure of this. People will have more and more reason to be putting their faith in something other than God for salvation, to be putting their faith in so many different truths. Even evil will be celebrated and called good. The real goodness will be called evil and hate. And this will spread to such an extent that there will come a point when the gospel is almost completely choked out. No human being will be saved had the days not been cut short. And when it comes to that point, what would be the point for God to even keep things going? As we have learned, the point of this period of delay and increasing tribulation is to spread the gospel. And when that mission is over, then the world is over. I think that much we can say for sure. The other thing we can say for sure is that when Jesus does return, it will be perfectly clear to us as Christians that he has returned. This is what Jesus wants us to keep in mind through all of the tribulations that we are called to face and all of the deceptions and fake news that will be running rampant. We must remember this: Christ is coming back. And we will know it when he does. There won't be any doubt in our minds as Christians, like lightning that flashes across the entire sky, like a kettle of vultures circling a corpse. This world will be a corpse, a lifeless husk in terms of spiritual life that comes from God. It will be a pitiful shell of what God had made it to be. And then the end. The disciples had asked, what would be the sign of Jesus' coming? And Jesus says, don't worry, you won't miss it. And then he describes what will happen when at last he does come, when he comes at last. Reading from verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And that was Matthew chapter 24, verses 29 through 31. Now, throughout Scripture, stars falling from heaven and the darkness of the moon and the sun these are synonymous with God's judgment. Oftentimes in the Old Testament and in Jewish tradition, the stars were even equated with spiritual powers and principalities, with angelic beings. And so it is possible to see this verse as hinting that God will cast down or defeat the various spiritual entities that had been conspiring to lead humanity further down this spiral of destruction and degradation. Now, we know certainly God will do this. The only question is whether perhaps this verse is pointing to that reality or to a literal darkening of the sky at his coming. Maybe both. Now, what will appear in the sky, whether literally darkened or not, is the sign of the Son of Man. And a good translation of this, if you're wondering what this is, a good translation of this phrase would show us that the sign being spoken of here is the unfurled banner of the Son of Man. These are his banners of war, his flags, and his entrance of the Messiah as the Messiah at his second coming. Now we read that Christ will appear ready for battle, but also with cloud and trumpet, which is actually a reference back to when the presence of God descended on Mount Sinai to give the law. The cloud of God's terrible presence, which frightened the people almost to death, to the point where they were begging Moses to be the one who approached God. And then the trumpet of the archangel, which both announces God's presence, but also summons his faithful to his side. Now, these things happen all at once, and when they happen, there is a dual effect. To those who made God their enemy, there is only fear and regret and trembling. But to those who gave God their loyalty, there is escape and reward. Escape. Escape from what? Escape from God's final and terrible judgment. Escaping this judgment is the point of the rapture, which we will learn of next. Reading now from verse 32. The fig tree learn its lesson as soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves. You know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Yes, the rapture is real. When the rapture will take place is debated, but what is certain is that as Christians, we will be subjected to the tribulations of this dying world in some form or another. But equally certain is that we will be saved as God's people from God's vengeful judgment. When these things will happen exactly, we cannot know. But Jesus has counseled us to understand that just like the fig tree, and as it begins to bear signs of the summer days to come, so also the world is bearing its signs. And we need to understand that Jesus is coming soon. When he does, 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken up by the angel who comes to claim God's faithful ones, and the one next to him, the one without faith, that one will be left to receive God's judgment. Now we understand as Christians we can never know for sure which day will be our last. Our last day to honor God, our last day to love our children, to honor our mother and father, to help and to encourage God's church, to fulfill our calling as Christians, to make our stand for the gospel in this world. We just don't know how many days that we have left. And so that is why we live every day as we do, to honor God and to do the things that he has called us to do. And in this way, we will be sure to heed Christ's words, the ones that we have read about this morning, and we will be ready for the day when he comes again, or when he takes us home by way of death. But either way, we are ready. We must be ready. That is the last thing that Jesus will emphasize and say on the matter as we read finally from verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, well, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him into pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And that is Matthew chapter 24, verses 45 through 51. My friends, there are 2 things that the Lord will judge us by. Were we faithful? Were we wise? The truth is, these are one and the same. For in order to be faithful, we must be wise. We must be wise enough to see that the things that Jesus has been telling us today, these things are for us, so that we can be ready, so that we can be ready. So that we can remember that the stakes have never been higher for the people of God, and that the world has never been darker, and it grows darker every day. And one day it may grow so dark that it might be easy to say that the light may never come again. Maybe we have entered a dark night like that already, personally, I can't say, but perhaps for some we have had a foretaste of that darkest night. And in that night, it will be easy to wonder whether the light will come. And if it will never come, then what difference does any of this make at all? And then the temptation will be to live like it doesn't matter. But in moments such as these, we must say to ourselves, foolish servant, remember God. He is coming. And it is my prayer for every one of us that when we do finally meet him at last, he will find us doing what he called us to do. What a blessing that will be. No regrets, no excuses, just faithfulness and blessing. O good and faithful servant, do not lose heart, never give up. May our love never grow cold. Let us set our hearts and minds on these things this morning. Let us be ready for that day, for the day that we meet him in the sky and come marching in with all of the saints. Let us be ready for that day. Amen.